Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 7th of November, where I wanted to put a little bit of closure onto the film that we've been watching on A Midsummer Night's Dream and begin talking about the play. And if you'll note in the notes below, I have a link that will get you to our online registration catalog, which will list all of the spring classes as well as the intersession classes that we are offering. We're offering just a handful of intersession classes. Those are highly condensed classes that meet in January, and they usually meet daily, Monday through Friday. But in about 3.5 weeks or so, you could finish an entire semester's worth of work. But it's not for the faint of heart. And you can see that options are limited. And most of the classes are in the spring. And you'll also note that I have included a flyer for a class that I teach that is not an English class. The English class that I'm teaching next semester is Introduction to Shakespeare. We begin actually with A Midsummer Night's Dream. If you are interested in taking a 200 level literature class that is online, you might be interested in taking the Shakespeare class, which is run very similar to this class. But another class that I teach that is not an English class is a communications class, CMN 201, and that's the horror film in media and popular culture. And that's what the flyer is in the notes below. You can see that a list of the films that we study over the course of the semester. So if you have any questions about it, feel free to let me know. So in terms of where we are, I had you watching A Midsummer Night's Dream, the Hoffman version from 1999. And obviously, this is a Hollywood version, so adapting Shakespeare for a general audience is no easy trick. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to watch this particular performance. For my Introduction to Shakespeare class, we actually watch a performance that was done in Shakespeare's reconstructed Globe Theater that is, or attempts to be, more authentic. That's not to say that they don't take their liberties either. But I thought that for a introduction to literature class, it would be interesting to talk about how we could go about making Shakespeare accessible to the masses. So Hollywood understands that one of the ways it generates audiences, it's through its actors. So it hired for this particular production A-list actors, at least A-list actors for the time, such as Kevin Kline or Callista Flockhart. And that said, I think that helped to bring in audiences. The first time that I watched this particular version of Midsummer Night's Dream, I saw it in the theater. And the theater was actually quite full with a wide range of audience members. Stanley Tucci was also in the film. You probably know him from Hunger Games, though he hadn't necessarily achieved the kind of fame when the film came out in the late 1990s that he has since then. And they also decide to set the film in a different time period than Shakespeare's time. It's set in 1800s, Victorian period. And I suspect one of the reasons why they did that is because most people have a general conception of the Victorian period as being one of great repression, particularly sexual repression. And that certainly is one of the messages that happens to be embedded within the film, the importance of female in particular maintaining virginity, which would have definitely been an issue during the Renaissance. Because they set it in the 1800s Victorian period, that means that the costumes obviously are not historical as well. And we get a little bit of an opening preamble to sort of set the scene. That isn't something that we would see in the play proper either, where we are told that not only are necklines high, but there is this newfangled invention called the bicycle. And I can't understand why a bicycle would have been introduced outside of the fact that it's visually interesting. I don't think it's necessary to have the actors on bicycles per se. What we do get also are a lot of outdoor scenes because we have a version that is not limited to the stage. And I think that's one of the strengths of the film, is that we see all of the lush green scenery in a way that we wouldn't necessarily see if we were watching it on stage. And notice how all of these scenes of light and lushness turn to rain and darkness. And when we switch to the fairy kingdom, the fairies being known not for being evil necessarily, but for being mischievous, and also for having a dark element to them. So that helps to set the tone. And because this is a Hollywood film, they also have access to special effects, which I don't think they overuse. I think they use them judiciously in this particular instance. And I appreciate that, because special effects can oftentimes overpower story. That said, our story is condensed. Shakespearean plays tend to be rather long, but for the most part, I think this production does a fairly good job of sort of translating what it is that we would have seen in terms of a stage performance with Shakespeare's vision. But there are some story changes. Certainly, as I had indicated, the time period is different. The bicycles are different. And the biggest change that I am never going to support is that the character of Bottom is given a wife in the film version that we saw. And in the actual play itself, Bottom does not have a wife. I think that's quite important, that Bottom is the only one who's single at the beginning of the play. And while certainly he's manipulated by love juice as the play progresses, he comes up with the understanding that man is an ass and a patched fool. Of course, there's some irony here because it's coming from the most foolish and asinine character of all. But Bottom has an insight that the other characters don't have. And I would suggest one of the reasons why Bottom has that insight is because he is not involved in a love relationship at the beginning of the play. So I wish they hadn't made necessarily that particular change. Now, I'm well aware that this is not a Shakespeare class. This is a introduction to Shakespeare. So what I wanted to do was to go through the plot with you, just to make sure that you've got an understanding of the play itself. And then next class, we could start talking about the themes. And the plot is quite complex, deliberately so, to reinforce the idea that love is complex. And I always recommend that you keep a chart of the characters. We're going to have multiple couplings, and people are going to be falling in and out of love with one another, to illustrate a theme that love is quite fickle. That even though we maintain that we will love someone forever, that's not the case. In fact, we could easily switch partners. So keeping a chart of the characters, and in some ways it's almost like a soap opera, trying to keep track of the love relationships at any particular point in time, which are constantly shifting. Again, thematically, that's a statement about love and how fickle it is and unpredictable it is. But it also helps us to, I think, see all of the ways that everyone is influenced by the follies of love, because we're introduced to lots of different levels of characters based on age or status and just state of relationship, whether it be dating or it be engagement or it be actual marriage. And regardless, everyone is having love difficulties. And the first couple that we're introduced to is Theseus and Hippolyta. That's a King Theseus and a Queen Hippolyta. So they are at the very top of the chain of being in that hierarchy that the Renaissance would have ranked everyone in, where God would have been at the highest point, and then the angels would have been ranked accordingly, and then finally humans, and then animals, and so forth and so on. But the king and queen would be the closest to God, in effect. But King Theseus has his own love problems. He has gotten Queen Hippolyta, who is the queen of the Amazons, very strong warrior female race. He's gotten Hippolyta through war. He's conquered her in war. This is a kind of typical love, a love that results out of conquest or for political union or for social advancement. The idea was that affection developed after marriage, not before marriage. And obviously, at the beginning of the play, Hippolyta is not too pleased about the fact that she's been conquered. But we also know we're reading a comedy and watching a comedy, so that by the ending of the play, she's not upset. And again, we can assume that their affection continues to develop and progress after marriage. Hermia and Lysander, they're younger than King Theseus and Hippolyta, and they're also nobles. They're not necessarily king and queen. That said, they are a young dating couple, so they aren't engaged. They aren't quite at that level yet. And they're quite happy with one another. The love difficulty that they encounter is that Hermia's father, Aegeus, does not approve of their union. Aegeus basically wants Hermia to be with another man, Demetrius. And there really is no good reason for it, outside of the fact that he has told her so. So if you've ever perhaps had an argument with somebody in a position of power and you've questioned them and their response is, because I told you so, then perhaps you can understand this dynamic about power struggles in love, particularly with a father who would be having a daughter viewed as a kind of piece of property to dispense of as he so wished, to ultimately then she could be owned as a piece of property by her husband. So the fact that a child, and a female child no less, a daughter, would dare to defy her father is huge. And in some ways, Shakespeare was rather contemporary and rather progressive in his place. And this is a kind of atypical love because we have a daughter defying her father. Now, we're introduced to another young couple of around the same status and age, Helena and Demetrius. Now, Helena and Demetrius, prior to the play, had been in love. But it turns out that at the start of the play, Demetrius no longer loves Helena. In fact, he has left Helena, and worse yet, he's decided that he no longer loves Helena, and he's left her for Helena's best friend, Hermia. Nothing good can come out of this, as you can suspect. And of course, Demetrius is the choice that Hermia's father wants for Hermia, but Hermia has no desire. She wants to be with Lysander. So when we see someone like Helena and Demetrius, or even Demetrius and Hermia, what we get is this idea of unrequited love. If one person is in love and the other isn't. Notice how similar the names are, Hermia and Helena, so that we can mix them up with one another. Again, very deliberate, showing that one's lover is not unique. One could easily be exchanged for another. The appearances are quite different. Helena is tall and blonde, and that would have been considered the epitome of beauty during the time period of the Renaissance. Hermia is short and brunette, and yet the tall blonde doesn't have any of the male's attention, and it's the short brunette that has the attention of two men, Lysander and Demetrius. Again, rather interesting statement from Shakespeare. We continue on with being introduced to another love relationship, this time not human. This is the fairy world. The fairies should be above the humans in the chain of being and that ranking of hierarchy. But they too have their love problems. And Fairy Oberon and Fairy Titania, they're older, but they are also married. So they represent a different stage of relationship. They're not dating, they're not engaged, they're married. And they're arguing at this point. And they're arguing over a changeling. Now, changelings are something that belongs to fairy folklore. And Shakespeare used fairy folklore in this play, but he would change it to suit his purposes. So in fairy folklore, a changeling was a fairy baby that was left in place by the fairies and in place of a human baby that the fairies would steal in the middle of the night. It was a way for human parents actually to justify any kind of challenges that their babies might have. They could argue that these were not their real babies, that instead their real babies were kidnapped in the middle of the night by fairies, and what was left were these changeling babies. But Shakespeare doesn't necessarily use that fairy folklore, but what he does do is he introduces the idea of a changeling boy, that Queen Titania, one of her serving women, died in childbirth, and Queen Titania feels the obligation to raise that boy. It's called a changeling boy. And Oberon wants that changeling boy. Oberon never really indicates why or gives any justification, nor does he need to, because he's the husband. And the idea is that whatever the husband asks or demands, he should get without question. Not only does Titania question and dare to say no, but also Titania has forsworn his marriage bed. And what that means is that she's denying him sexual relations. So that shows some of the power difficulties involved in love. And then lastly, one last subplot we're introduced to. Bottom and his cohorts, they're laborers. They are providing humor, but they are also rehearsing a play within a play, very typical of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was quite meta, and they're rehearsing a play about love. So their play will mirror much of what we are seeing in the play. So now that we've been introduced to all of these major characters, and again, I suggest you might want to keep a chart of these and indicate in the chart when we have the love relationships change. Aegeus, who is so upset with his daughter who won't follow his will, has gone to the highest law of the land, that's King Theseus, and asked King Theseus to intervene and to basically order Hermia to listen to her father. The only modern day parallel I can think of is perhaps a desperate parent calling 911, demanding that 911 tell their child that it's time to go to bed or something like that. But at any rate, so Theseus does do that, and Theseus tells Hermia to follow her father's orders, and if she doesn't, she'll face either a nunnery or death. Both would be considered equally horrible. A nunnery meaning that she would live a life of celibacy, or death, which would be, again, comparable in many ways. Certainly she'd be celibate, and there wouldn't be any opportunity for her to have any kind of life. But she is given time to contemplate her options. Now, this is necessary from a thematic perspective, from a plot perspective, so that we can have the plot unfold. But I think it also is necessary from a thematic perspective in the sense that ultimately King Theseus has his own love problems with his own issues with Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. And King Theseus also realizes that he doesn't necessarily want to get involved in this dispute. It's lose-lose. No matter how he decides, someone's going to be unhappy. So delaying a decision gives the opportunity that perhaps the parties involved would come to a resolution on their own, and then he doesn't have to get involved. It's a great politician trick. Don't commit to anything. And of course, from a plot perspective, it's important because it gives the young lovers an opportunity to come up with a plan. Hermia and Lysander decide that what they're going to do, as many young lovers do when their parents don't approve, is that they are going to run away together. And they run away to the woods or the wilderness, things that are wild and untamed. We talked about this with young Goodman Brown. As opposed to the beginning of the play, which is Athens, which is the city, its civilization, its order. Now, when people are in love, they oftentimes don't think rationally, and I think this is what we see here. Hermia tells her best friend Helena that Hermia and Lysander are going to run away. Perhaps you can understand that, and that you tell your best friend oftentimes secrets. Helena takes that information and decides to tell Demetrius, hoping that Demetrius will feel so indebted to her, Helena, that Demetrius will love Helena once again. Absolutely absurd, but that goes to show how irrational love is. What Demetrius does with this information, he decides to run into the woods so that he can pursue Hermia. And that means that Helena runs into the woods so that she can pursue Demetrius. So basically, we've got the four lovers in the woods at this point. Helena and Demetrius and Hermia and Lysander. Of course, the fairy king and queen are in the woods as well. So one last coupling or last set of characters that aren't in the woods at this point is Bottom and his cohorts, but they decide that they're going to rehearse their play, which is called Pyramus and Thisbe, which is about love, in the woods, so they won't be disturbed by, let's say, prying eyes in Athens. Maybe we have to suspend a little bit of disbelief here, but it certainly is a way to bring Bottom and those characters into the woods, so Shakespeare has everybody in a different locale. So, Fairy Oberon, who's very, very upset with his queen, Titania, because she refuses to obey his will to give him the changeling boy. Oberon orders his servant, Puck, who is a fairy, and Puck is a fairy and fairy folklore, who's known to cause mischief, not evil necessarily, but mischief. He'll curdle milk, for instance, or cause people to trip. Gives Puck orders that he should distract Titania with love juice. And while she is falling in love with the first thing that she sees, then Oberon can take the changeling. It's a commentary on love, that when we are in love, things that used to matter to us, even our own children perhaps, no longer are of importance. And Oberon makes the decision that he wants to try to help Helena. He's overheard Helena and Demetrius. And because he feels a certain level of empathy, Oberon tells Puck, put the love juice onto the man wearing the Athenian garb, so that he will love Helena again. Now, these instructions are vague. There are two men wearing Athenian garb, Lysander and Demetrius. This is where you can have a lot of fun playing Puck if you are an actor, because you can play this as if Puck makes an innocent mistake and chooses the wrong man wearing the Athenian garb. Rather than Demetrius, he puts the love juice on Lysander's eyes. So all kinds of conflicts are going to result. And that could be an honest mistake, or it could be very deliberate because Puck wants to entertain himself. Regardless, and again, this is a decision a director would make along with the actor to how to play this, whether it's ambivalent, we're not sure, or whether it's clearly a mistake, or whether it's clearly deliberate. But nevertheless, what Puck does is he puts the love juice onto Lysander's eyes. So when Lysander awakes, the first thing he sees is Helena, and he falls in love with Helena. This is very bad. Helena assumes that a terrible joke's being played on her because he is supposed to love her best friend, Hermia. Puck also decides to act on his own, just for entertainment, and put love juice onto Bottom. Or turn Bottom, I should say, into an ass. This is after he has put love juice onto Titania's eyes. And Titania just so happens, the queen of the fairies, to wake up and see Bottom, who is now a literal ass. He's been acting like an ass throughout the entire play, arrogant and misstating things and so forth. But Puck thought it would be great fun to turn him into a literal ass. So now what we have is the fairy queen in love with a literal and figurative ass, to illustrate that love is blind, and that when we are in love, we can oftentimes fall in love with an ass and not even realize it. Timeless and universal themes within the play. So at this point, we know that things have to, in one way or another, be resolved. So what Puck does is that he puts the love juice onto the correct gentleman's eyes. So this would be Demetrius. But now both Demetrius and Lysander, because the love juice is not removed from Lysander's eyes, both of them love Helena, the tall blonde, not Hermia, the short brunette. This gets us into Act 3, and if you're thinking about a kind of triangle, where at the bottom left-hand side is Act 1, the introduction of characters, and then we begin the ascent. Act 2 would be moving up the left-hand side of that triangle, and that would be the beginning of conflict. And then the tip or the top of the triangle would be Act 3, and that would be the height of conflict. And this is when all the lovers are basically throwing insults to one another, where Helena is sure that everybody is playing a terrible joke on her because nobody was interested in her before. Hermia is sure that her former best friend, Helena, has stolen her man. And the insults are flying, and we'll start talking about some of the language and why they're insults. Insults such as, you dwarf, you minimus, you puppet. A puppet is something that's controlled by someone else, so that would be insulting. But puppet, dwarf, and minimus, these are all small. This is in reference to Hermia's height. So these are insults against Hermia's height. And other insults, such as painted maypole, which are directed at Helena. A maypole is tall and thin, like Helena. And also, the maypole comes with some folklore associated with it. May Day is referenced in this play, and May Day is a pagan holiday, and I know that oftentimes it used to be celebrated by dancing around a maypole. It's a pagan holiday that celebrates the beginning of spring. It's the 1st of May. And it is celebrated through rites of fertility, which means a lot of sexual activity. And it's interesting that the play would be referencing that date when virginity is so important for female during this time period. Again, Shakespeare's winking a nod here. And also, the maypole was supposed to be a symbol during May Day for the phallus. So basically, Hermia has just told or has just called her former best friend, Helena, a phallus, a penis. Painted is in reference to makeup, wearing a false face, a facade. There's something that loose women would do, a strumpet would do, a harlot would do. So you put those two together, a painted maypole, and that is indeed quite the insult. So even think about the title, A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's supposed to take place in midsummer. Midsummer is not May Day. Midsummer is the equinox. It's the longest day of the year. I believe it's June 21st. But it also is another pagan holiday that is celebrated through rites of fertility and sexual activity. So all of this is embedded in the play and oftentimes not talked about with younger audiences. But at any rate, if this were a tragedy, these lovers would come to blows and kill one another, but we know it's a comedy, so things have to be resolved. So what that means is that the Puck has to intervene, as does Oberon, remove the love juice from Lysander's eyes. So that means he goes back to loving Hermia. Keep the love juice on Demetrius's eyes, so that he remains loving Helena the way he did prior to the play. Again, you might not say that this is a happy situation because ultimately Demetrius is being forced to love someone against his will. However, the way it would have been viewed during the Renaissance is that Demetrius had pledged himself to Helena prior to the play, so this would be a restoration of order. The love juice is removed from Titania after Fairy Oberon takes the changeling boy. So now Fairy Oberon has won, so to speak, this battle of wills. He has the changeling boy. He's humiliated Titania. She realizes I was in love with an ass. The donkey spell is removed from Bottom, so he's no longer a literal donkey. By the way, the donkey would have been known as the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. Again, another sexual reference from Shakespeare because it's pretty clear that Titania and Bottom, as donkey, consummate their relationship. That said, this donkey spell is removed, but Bottom still remains a figurative ass, if not a literal ass, even though he's returned to human form. And now, since it turns out that the four noble couples are happy, King Theseus makes a decision that since the couples are happy, he's not going to intervene. Aegeus is unhappy, obviously, Hermia's father, because he's not going to get his will. But Hermia gets to stay with Lysander, and Helena gets to stay with Demetrius, and it seems all four of them are happy. So this is probably the best of all possible worlds. And in theory, the play could end here. Again, if we're thinking about that pyramid, Act 4 is usually the descent on the right side of the pyramid, where we're beginning to get resolution of conflict. And then we get Act 5, which is the ending of the pyramid, where we get resolution. However, in our Midsummer Night's Dream, it seems like everything is all tied up in Act 4, and we still have an Act 5. The play within a play, the performance of Pyramus and Thisbe. And nothing is accidental with Shakespeare. It's not as if it was tacked on. There are lots of good reasons why that play is there, Pyramus and Thisbe. It's a ridiculous play with bad acting and bad writing. Deliberately so. Everything is taken so literally. It almost reminds me of a junior high school production or even an elementary school production. And this is quite deliberate for Shakespeare to show what his competition would have been doing at the time. They would have been engaged in poor play acting and poor play writing. So this is in contrast to Shakespeare's own works. Of course, Pyramus and Thisbe is about love and thwarted love and how love can go badly. In fact, it might even remind you of another play of Shakespeare's, Romeo and Juliet. Scholars think it was probably written around the same time as Midsummer. Again, we're not exactly sure when these plays were written, but we do know that usually the comedies were towards the beginning of Shakespeare's career and the tragedies were more towards the ending, but that's not to say that he couldn't mix and match. This would be a wonderful way for Shakespeare to reference perhaps a play that was already out, if it was indeed the case that Romeo and Juliet was out, it would bring forth parallels, and audience members would think, well, Romeo and Juliet is so much better than Pyramus and Thisbe. Or it could be a way to promote Romeo and Juliet, that Pyramus and Thisbe is so absurd, so that when Romeo and Juliet does come out, we can see how much more superior it is than anything Pyramus and Thisbe could ever produce. There's a lot of humor in the play, a lot of physical humor, so there's great opportunity there. A lot of bawdiness, a lot of sexual references. I'll talk about some of them next class. Shakespeare never loses an opportunity for a sexual reference. What's important is that all of the characters, the human characters, are watching this performance. And they're taking great delight in mocking the absurdity of Pyramus and Thisbe. But they never once stopped to consider that they themselves had been equally absurd when it came to love. Hermia, Helena, Demetrius, Lysander, and even Theseus and Titania were all, or I should say, Theseus and Hippolyta, were all equally ridiculous when it came to love. So they never have any insight into themselves, which is a Shakespearean commentary that they haven't learned, and oftentimes people don't see their own absurd behavior, even though they can evaluate it in others. And ultimately, the commentaries for us, because if we watched all of this in delight and we were able to mock all these characters and we never saw parallels with ourselves about how we have acted equally asinine in love, and I use that term deliberately, then we've learned nothing. It's one of the reasons for Puck's final speech, which is how the play ends. If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here. And it's perhaps one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches. At this point in the play, just about everybody has been offended because everybody has been shown to be an idiot in love. So it's not a bad idea to have Puck there sort of trying to apologize, saying, if you were offended, remember this is just a play, it's not real. Puck is almost like a Shakespeare character as well, controlling and manipulating action. So this is a good way for Shakespeare, perhaps, to apologize to audience. But this is a backhanded apology because Puck says, if I am an honest Puck, and if we have unearned luck. And the thing is, Puck is not honest. So if Puck says he's sorry, and we know that Puck is not honest, does that mean he's really not sorry? Again, this is a wonderful way to kind of upset the apple cart, so to speak, at the very ending of the play. So Shakespeare gives us an apology, but it's a questionable apology. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the major elements in the play. So I had indicated midsummer is important because of the spring equinox, or the summer equinox, the longest day of the year. Also, night. And of course, nighttime is a time that oftentimes is associated with mystery and magic and sexuality, and dreams. And think about how dreams can be compared to love. Even some of the language that we use, that we fall asleep or we fall in love. And think about all of the negative associations with fall. Someone can get hurt. Someone can die. Falls are something you usually try to prevent. They usually are something that can be embarrassing, for instance. They can't be controlled, for instance. And much like dreams. And think about all of the ways that dreams are associated with love. Dreams are fictional. Or perhaps that's part of the statement, that love isn't real because dreams aren't real. Dreams can often be nightmares. Dreams have an ending. Perhaps love has an ending. Dreams can't be controlled, just like love can't be controlled. Love is like a magical spell. I use that term deliberately. Once we're under this spell, we're no longer able to think with reason or rationality. It's as if we are asleep. Notice how often these characters are asleep, and they aren't aware of what's happening around them. So this gives you hopefully an understanding of some of the elements in terms of plot and title. What I wanted to do next class is to talk about some of the themes and some of the language within the play. As you know, I am working my way through paper number 1. It's going to take me a little bit longer than I had originally intended, but I will get those papers back to you with enough time so that you could rewrite them for a higher grade if you so elected to. Once I return them to you, you can do a revision. I just ask that you submit in your revision along with the original graded copy with my commentary so I can compare and contrast the two. And you've got up until the ending of the semester to do that, but the sooner the better for everybody involved, obviously. And your second paper is going to be on drama, and it'll be very similar to what you did with the first paper. I'll give you options, and I'll have some printed up paper topics for you that will allow you to talk either about canon or contemporary relevance, or you can create your own topic, but you do need to get that topic approved by me. That would be due at the very ending of the semester. Where we are now is about midway through our drama section. We have put closure onto Oedipus, so that's one of the plays that you have the option of writing on. We are in the midst of Midsummer Night's Dream, and we will be putting closure onto it soon. My hope is that you have finished reading the play, or you're close to finishing reading the play. And then our third drama, and this will be our last drama in the drama section, is A Raisin in the Sun. And I think you'll find this to be an easier read. It's more contemporary. It's set in the United States, so I think it's going to seem more familiar to you. This is the drama that was not included in your textbook. I had ordered it as a separate text. However, you can find it in any of a number of venues, use bookstores, libraries, so forth. And I was able to actually find a copy of the actual paperback that I ordered for our class online in a free link. And you'll see that in the 5th section in the notes below for Raisin in the Sun. So that's another way that you can access it. And once again, we will watch performance and then talk about some of the themes in the play. So once that's over with, we'll start poetry, and that'll be our last unit for the semester. There won't be time for you to write a paper about poetry, but there will be time for a final exam that will be mostly devoted to poetry. Though there will be a couple of brief questions on short story, a couple brief questions on drama, and you get to choose within those questions. So that sort of gives you a way to sort of complete the class holistically of all of the 3 pieces. But the bulk of the writing for the final exam, which will be open book, open notes, be similar to writing a paper, but rather than having 2 weeks, you'll have 2 hours. Or I'm sorry, you'll have 24 hours because this is an online class. If you were taking the class in person, you'd have 2 hours. But since this is an online class, I'll give you 24 hours to take that examination and to submit it in to me. And I wouldn't be expecting anything as neat or as polished as what you might do with the paper. But basically, I'm just going to select some of the poems that we've talked about in class and ask you to discuss them in greater depth. But we'll talk about that final as we get a little bit closer. So where we are now is sort of in the midst of a midsummer. I am working my way through the papers that you've submitted for paper number 1. If you have not submitted a paper yet for paper number 1, you should be contacting me and letting me know what's going on. And for today's attendance question, and this will be due on Thursday, the 9th. And yes, I'm also a little bit behind with the attendance questions, but I hope to catch up sooner rather than later. The question, which is on our class discussion form, which will be due on the 9th, is who is your favorite character in A Midsummer Night's Dream and why? Obviously, no right or wrong answer here. I'm more interested in your reasoning. And while you're not required to respond to your classmates, you are required to read their responses, my responses in turn. If nothing else, it might give you an idea to pursue for a paper, or it could be something that could be useful for a final exam. You never know. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. Take care. Bye-bye.